The United States spends billions of dollars every year trying to control its southern border. It has built walls, deployed drones, and employs nearly 20,000 Border Patrol agents. And yet, almost 15 million people live in the country today without legal status, and less than 1% of those looking to reside permanently can do so legally. While politicians argue, undocumented workers pick fruit in California, clean hotel rooms in Las Vegas, and build houses in Texas. Their hands sustain much of the nation's daily life, but their names appear in no official record. How can the country with one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world also have the largest undocumented population? For some, the system is broken. For others, it's a lack of control. The truth is more uncomfortable. The system works this way because it's meant to. It's not a flaw, it's a design that keeps these workers without full rights to cut costs, keep prices steady, and guarantee labor flexibility. And to understand how this balance came to be, we must go back to the beginning, to when the United States first learned to decide who could enter and who was never meant to belong. Between the late 19th and mid-20th century, millions of people came to the United States looking for a new opportunity. The country opened its doors to Irish escaping famine, to Italians fleeing poverty, and to Jews persecuted in Eastern Europe. All of them crossed the Atlantic with the hope of a better future. The most powerful image of that promise was Ellis Island, the gateway to New York, which between 1892 and 1954 received more than 12 million immigrants. But Ellis Island was not just a place of welcome, it was also a filter. The United States opened its doors to those it needed and closed them to those it didn't. Doctors and officials examined every person, and anyone who didn't seem fit for work was marked and sent back on the same ship. It was a selective system, designed to take advantage of the immigrants' labor force. And soon, that logic became law when in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first major immigration law in the United States, banning the entry of Chinese workers and denying citizenship to those who were already living in the country. In 1924, the Immigration Act was approved, creating a quota system based on nationality, which would not be abolished until 1965. It favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, and drastically restricted those from the South and East, such as Italians, Greeks, and Poles. Meanwhile, Asians were practically excluded altogether. The goal was to preserve a very clear cultural and racial ideal, a white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant country. At the same time, the relationship with Mexican migrants was completely different. In times of economic expansion or labor shortages, the doors were opened, but in times of crisis came the raids and mass deportations. They could enter to work, but not to stay. That pattern became institutionalized with the Bracero Program, signed between the United States and Mexico during the Second World War. Between 1942 and 1964, more than 4 million workers were legally hired to work in agriculture and construction. They lived in camps, earned low wages, and had no union rights. And when the program ended, immigration didn't disappear, it simply continued informally. For decades, millions of workers crossed the border to harvest crops or work in construction, and most returned home after each season. It was tolerated immigration because it was useful. There were no walls, no militarization, and no federal surveillance system with massive deportations, except for a few isolated cases. What existed was a tacit agreement. The United States needed immigrants, but only as a temporary and subordinate workforce. But that logic began to change in the 1980s and early 1990s when the United States was facing unemployment, inflation, and rising urban violence. The economy had moved past its industrial boom, and millions of factory jobs were being lost to global competition. At the same time, drug consumption skyrocketed, and violence linked to Latin American cartels made newspaper headlines. In that atmosphere of uncertainty, immigrants began to be blamed as part of the problem. They were no longer seen only as cheap labor, they were accused of causing crime, unemployment, and insecurity. And the media played a key role in this shift. Alarmist headlines spoke of an invasion on the southern border. Images of caravans, raids, and seized drugs fueled the idea of a country under siege, while television programs and certain political speeches repeated that immigrants weren't coming to work but to commit crimes. Public opinion turned sharply against immigration, and according to a Pew Research Center survey, by 1994, 63% of Americans believed immigrants were a burden on the country. To avoid losing public support, politicians hardened their positions. In 1994, with the so-called Operation Gatekeeper, the Clinton administration began the systematic militarization of the southern border. It was the first time that large sections of wall, sensors, and watchtowers were built on a massive scale. That operation marked the beginning of a new era. The border stopped being an invisible line and became a physical symbol of distrust toward immigrants. In 1996, Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, known as IIRIRA, a law that would fundamentally reshape the U.S. immigration system. It was presented as a necessary reform to regain control of the borders and bring order to what was described as a chaotic system. But in practice, it didn't solve the crisis, it only made it worse. The law introduced measures that seemed reasonable at first glance, such as the so-called 3- and 10-year bars. Anyone who had stayed in the country without documents for more than 6 months had to leave and wait 3 years before applying for legal residency. If the irregular stay was longer than 1 year, the punishment was extended to 10 years. These penalties were meant to discourage illegal entry, but their real effects were very different. Before this law, many undocumented workers used to enter and leave the country freely, spending seasons in the United States and then returning to their families. After 1996, that mobility became impossible because leaving meant risking a near-permanent ban on coming back. A law designed to stop irregular immigration ended up encouraging millions of people to stay undocumented inside the United States permanently. The law also turned deportation into an almost automatic process. Until then, immigration judges had some discretion. They could consider how long someone had lived in the country, whether they had a family there, or how serious their offense was. With the new law, much of that discretion disappeared. The IIRIRA, along with the Anti-Terrorism and Defective Death Penalty Act passed the same year, drastically expanded the types of crimes that could trigger deportation, created the category of aggravated felony, and restricted the legal defenses available before judges. Some minor offenses or administrative errors became grounds for deportation, and the new rules were even applied retroactively. That meant people who had committed small infractions 20 years earlier and who had never reoffended could now be deported. With this law, restrictive measures and deportations multiplied. And then came September 11, 2001, which pushed the borders to close even tighter. Immigration stopped being seen as a social or economic issue and became a matter of national security. In 2002, the George W. Bush administration reorganized the entire federal apparatus and created the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, a massive department that absorbed the functions of 22 different agencies. From that structure emerged ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, an agency with extraordinary powers to detain, investigate, and deport immigrants. The official narrative changed as well. The undocumented immigrant was no longer seen as simply an irregular worker, but was portrayed as a constant suspect, even a potential terrorist. The border became the heart of American political identity, and what used to be a debate about the economy and labor turned into one about security, order, and national belonging. The consequences were felt at every level. Workplace raids multiplied, with armed agents storming in and arresting dozens or even hundreds of people at once. Immigration detention, once an exceptional measure, became central to the government's control strategy, and private detention centers spread across the country. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly could all be detained, often in conditions worse than those of the regular prison system. Despite all this enforcement, the structural causes of immigration didn't change. The demand for cheap labor in certain sectors of the economy continued, while families kept trying to reunite and asylum seekers kept arriving. At the same time, while the punitive apparatus expanded, no new legal pathways were opened. No broad regularization programs, no easier routes to citizenship. The system became overwhelmed and paralyzed, and the most recent numbers prove it. In 2023, more than 2.4 million attempts to cross the southern border were recorded, the highest level ever. That figure includes both irregular crossings and people who turned themselves in to request asylum. In 2024, the numbers remained high but started to decline steadily toward the end of the year and in 2025. Even so, the judicial system was unable to handle such volume. Today, more than 3 million cases are pending in immigration courts, and many take years to resolve. Meanwhile, between 14 and 15 million people live without legal status, trapped in a limbo where they aren't deported but can't obtain stable residency either. Everyone criticizes the system, but no one is willing to pay the political cost of changing it. And those who benefit the most from this model are the companies that rely on cheap, vulnerable labor. What seems at first like a broken system is a functional one for those who profit from its chaos. While many people talk about invasions, walls, and deportations, the truth is that the US economy simply couldn't function without immigrants. Just look at a few key sectors. Agriculture depends almost entirely on immigrant labor, both documented and undocumented. In California's fields, more than 70% of the workforce is foreign-born. They're the ones who plant, harvest, and process the food that ends up on millions of American tables. In construction, immigrants make up about 1/3 of all workers. And the hotel and restaurant industries are also run on immigrant labor: cooks, waiters, and cleaning staff. Invisible jobs that make everyday life in cities possible. Even healthcare increasingly depends on immigrants, from foreign-trained doctors to caregivers and nurses looking after an aging population. The country needs these workers, but the system makes sure to keep them in insecure conditions. Most have no legal or union stability, no political voice, and live under the constant threat of deportation. The system tolerates them because it depends on them. They're an invisible layer of workers holding up the foundations of the economy, with low wages, total availability, and no bargaining power. They act as a pressure valve that keeps the labor market flexible and prices artificially low. Because without this base of vulnerable workers, food, restaurants, housing, and home care would all cost far more. And it's not a flaw, it's a part of the design. And when we talk about instability, we're not only talking about undocumented immigrants. The fragility of the US immigration system takes many forms, like the temporary visa programs H-2A for agricultural jobs and H-2B for non-agricultural work. In theory, these visas provide a legal and orderly way to fill labor gaps in industries that lack local workers. But in practice, they create a form of legalized instability that keeps hundreds of thousands of people under complete control. Their growth has been staggering. In the early 2000s, only about 50,000 positions were certified each year under the H-2A program. By 2024, that number had jumped to more than 380,000 positions certified by the Department of Labor, an increase of almost eightfold in 2 decades. At the same time, in 2024, another 233,000 H-2B positions for non-agricultural jobs were certified, far more than what was traditionally allowed by law. That means every season, hundreds of thousands of workers arrive in the country legally, but without real rights. These are programs where the employer controls the worker's immigration status. If a worker complains, misses a day, or tries to organize, they can instantly lose their visa and be deported. In practice, they can't freely change employers because doing so requires a new sponsor and the risk of losing their legal status. They also can't stay beyond their contract period or negotiate fair working conditions like resident workers. Recent investigations have exposed unhealthy housing, overcrowded dorms, and workers sleeping on mattresses on the floor or in makeshift barracks. Exhausting workdays with no rest, unpaid overtime, and illegal debts imposed by employers to keep them obedient. They are legal workers, but trapped in a system of exploitation. For many large employers, these programs aren't an exception, they're a model. The idea of replacing local workers with temporary, renewable ones without citizenship has become the ultimate dream of some industries. The paradox is that this system isn't just tolerated, it's subsidized. Agriculture receives billions of dollars in public support every year. Federal money that keeps the sector afloat but doesn't require decent conditions for the people doing the work. The government pays, the companies profit, and the workers remain trapped in insecurity. In 1995, before the IIRIRA, there were around 5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Today, that number is estimated to be between 14 and 15 million. People who work, who pay taxes, who are an essential part of the economy, but who legally do not exist. Many have lived in the country for decades. They've bought homes, built businesses, and raised children who are US citizens. And yet, they have no real path to legalization. The system requires them to leave the country to start the process, but doing so would mean being barred from returning for 10 years. It's a dead end. On the streets and in workplaces, that exclusion feels like an invisible wall. A wall that doesn't stop those who want to enter, but traps those who are already inside. A wall that separates parents from children, divides families between those who have papers and those who don't, and turns every hospital visit, every police stop, and every bureaucratic errand into a threat of deportation. Promises of amnesty or legalization have been repeated, but they always crash against the same barrier: a structure designed to function this way, because it guarantees benefits for corporations, for politicians who exploit it, and for a system that has always found usefulness in immigrant fragility. And maybe that's the greatest illusion of all, believing that the US immigration system is broken when it works exactly as it was designed to. That's all for today's video. If you liked it, don't forget to watch the next one.